My name is Angel Yuri, and I will be presenting my paper regarding utang na loob, titled Not My Responsibility, the Ethical Implication of Rejecting Utang na loob in Families. In my paper, I argue that it is morally wrong to reject utang na loob given the socioeconomic status of the majority of Filipinos. So the Philippines is a third world country, and um, I think it will be not developing anytime soon. So from that, my paper will specifically answer the question, is it just and moral to reject the concept of utang na loob towards the family, considering the factor that the Philippines is a third world country and their family is in the poor and low income bracket of the population. So news reports have accounted that there has been a significant increase in the inflation rate of the country, specifically 5.1% in the first 9 months of 2022. And in the preceding month, it recorded a 7.7 inflation rate. In, uh, so research shows that an increase in inflation is also an increase in poverty, especially in developing countries. There are 17.7 million people in poverty and 40.7 million in the lower income bracket. So this makes up more than 50% or more than half of the total population of the Philippines. This means that if the inflation continues to rise, there would be a significant increase in the number of people that could not afford the basic necessities in their daily lives. Moreover, since the families are not able to afford daily necessities, it would be very likely that they could not afford the savings like for health, education, and retirement plans. So to evaluate the ethical implications of rejecting the tradition, we will enumerate the possible outcomes of rejecting it. So I will also be enumerating the outcomes for the wealthy family. However, I'd like to emphasize that there is no specific literature or research that lists down the outcomes that I've written in my paper. So what is in my paper are actually based purely on logical assumptions only. So moving on, we will examine the outcome of necessities. So for short-term necessities, these are the essentials in their daily lives, and long-term ones are for savings and insurance. So for wealthy families, there will be no significant change in their life if their offspring reject utang na loob, since they have the capacity to fund their own lifestyle. However, for the poor family, first is they will either there will be either no change, since if the parents still have the capacity to work. However, if the parents have no capacity to work, they will be left to be in debt. So the second one is the health aspect. So just like the first aspect, there will be no significant change if the offspring reject utang na loob, because again, they have the innate capacity to fund their own hospitalization. However, for the poor families, the first situation is they have to work while they are ill. Second, if they have no capacity to work, they will be in debt or they will be borrowing money just to pay for their hospitalization. Third, is the worst case scenario is, so if they cannot work and they don't have anyone to borrow money from, they have to ignore their illness. So third is family education. So first, there will be no significant change, since uh like the other outcomes, the wealthy families have their own funds for the other siblings' education. However, for the poor families, they have first is they have to work even if they are old, just to fund the other siblings' education. However, if the families or if the parents are not able to work because they are old or they don't really have the capacity to work anymore, they will be left to be in debt just to fund the younger siblings' education. So if these two doesn't work, the um the pressure or the responsibility of funding the education will be left to the younger siblings. So they have to work while they are studying. So these three scenarios doesn't work, the very likely outcome is they will be dropping out of school. So to evaluate the outcomes, we'll be using the theory of Act Utilitarianism. So this theory says that an action is right when it promotes the greatest net of happiness. And this formulation aims for the maximization of happiness. So there is another form of utilitarianism, which is rule utilitarianism, that states that an action would objectively be right when it conforms to moral rules. However, this is wrong or different from utilitarianism because utilitarianism somehow rejects Kant's view of absolute rules. So Kantian ethics would actually say that it is really wrong to tell lies, even if it leads to a higher good. However, utilitarianism would say that this is wrong because utilitarianism treats actions and outcomes differently. So for utilitarianism, it will be accepted or okay to disobey rules or tell lies if and only if it achieves a higher good or higher utility. So another point to consider is a problem that is actually brought about by the utilitarianism. So utilitarianism, some scholars say that it is being unreasonable by requiring the concept of self-sacrifice. So the utilitarian view imposes a commitment to equal consideration of impartiality of interest. So to simplify, if one is in a dilemma between shopping and donating their money to charity, utilitarianism would say that would push through doing the charity work since it results in a higher outcome and it satisfies the principle of self-sacrifice. So lastly, John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism proposes the proportionality doctrine. This doctrine states that actions are right as long as they proportionately promote happiness or pleasure. So Mill would say that there are different types of pleasure and there will be other pleasures that will be more valuable than others. For Mill, it will be intellect, feelings, imagination, moral sentiments, and judgment. However, there are some scholars that view this form of higher faculty differently. For Descartes, he viewed rationality or intellect as the defining factor for a human being, and human reason uses the operations of intuition and deduction that doesn't include or doesn't is not obstructed by feelings. Thus, Descartes would say that higher faculties only include human reason or intellect. And lastly, Mill would say that the best possible human life is when or where higher faculties play an adequate role in their life. So the first evaluation will be the maximization of utility. So utang na loob is a very individualistic approach in life, and it negates the family dependency that is to be followed when the offspring is older. So if the offspring rejects utang na loob, the sole beneficiary of the act will only be the offspring. However, this results in negative outcomes for low-earning families. So in the outcomes, we stated a while ago, specifically in family education, the worst case scenario is the sibling dropping out of school. So the positive outcomes of accepting utang na loob will be a lesser financial burden for the parents and also a greater assurance that the siblings education will continue. So however, on the other hand, the rejection will only benefit the offspring in the sense of financial freedom. So from these outcomes, the rejection will only benefit solely the offspring, while the acceptance of the decision will not only benefit the parents but also the siblings. So with that, utilitarianism would say that it is wrong to reject utang na loob since it results in lesser happiness and utility compared to when it is accepted. So the second evaluation is in accordance to the principle of self-sacrifice or impartiality. So um, let us examine this in the outcomes of health. So the worst possible scenario is the ignorance of the disease, possibly leading to death. So now let us examine the positive outcomes of accepting and of the outcomes of acceptance and the rejection together. So the positive outcomes of accepting utang na loob would be an easier health recovery for the parents. So on the other hand, the outcome of rejecting the tradition will only be financial freedom. So in this situation, Act Utilitarianism would argue that the rejection of utang na loob is wrong because it only considers the interest of the offspring rather than the physical health of the parents. Furthermore, if the offspring acts upon utang na loob, it coheres and satisfies the self-sacrificing nature of Act Utilitarianism. So last in the assessment is if the rejection of utang na loob conforms with higher pleasures in the faculties. So pleasures of the higher faculties are those in the intellect. So thus, we have to take into consideration the nature of the pleasure that the acceptance and rejection of utang na loob brings. So when one rejects the tradition and considers the socioeconomic status and possible outcomes, the pleasure it only feeds our feelings. So to elaborate, even though some may argue that this tolerates dependency, ignoring the possible outcomes will only um, feed the higher individual feelings. However, the acceptance of the tradition will feed the higher capacity of intellect because based on the other principles of Act Utilitarianism, it is wrong to reject utang na loob because of the possible negative consequences it brings to a family who are in the poor and lower earning side. Thus, it is rational to accept utang na loob. And Mill's utilitarianism would say that the acceptance of the tradition is right in the utilitarian perspective because um, the pleasure it brings feeds the higher faculty, which is the intellect. So, lastly is the objection. So one might argue that the acceptance of the tradition would be tolerating the behavior of dependency of the parents towards their offspring. At the same time, there will be a constant cycle of toxic dependency. And however, the rejection of utang na loob in a developing country will not, especially in a poor family, will not entirely bring about goodness. Instead, it will leave the poor parents um, with no the poor parents in alone. So the argument of the paper does not actually view utang na loob as moral. Rather, it seeks to argue that the rejection of utang na loob is unjust considering that many Filipino families or poor Filipino families do not have financial backup plans that can make them financially free when they retire. So citing utilitarianism once again, it is unjust to leave the families and the state in that state just for the sake of teaching financial literacy. So in conclusion, Act Utilitarianism would reject the idea of rejecting utang na loob. The rejection of this in the Act Utilitarian view does not rest upon the morality of utang na loob. Rather, it takes into account the possible consequences that rejection may bring to poor families. Since majority of Filipinos are still in the spectrum of low income, many are bound to experience the possible outcomes of rejecting utang na loob. In this case, Act Utilitarianism that conforming to this tradition is right to do because it brings about a higher number and more pleasure than rejecting utang na loob. And that's it. Thank you.